And clearly one of the greatest myths is that science has somehow disproven God, that science and atheism are one and the same. Allegedly, atheists are one big happy family united around a common core of democratic principles. These people have a very different perspective on what it means to be an atheist. Many come from conflicting and differing Marxist traditions, which, given their individual histories, they certainly haven't been beacons of human liberty.
What's up, heathens? How ya doing? Tonight, we are going to be going over a video where a Christian is going to be telling us 5 different myths that atheists still believe. Well, I should say myths with quotation marks, because these aren't really myths that we believe, but he thinks they are myths that atheists believe. So, he's going to take us through his top 5 lists of shit that atheists believe that we don't really believe, if you can believe that.
Now, as you might expect, given the topics that I cover here at Segue to Reason, I get my share of atheists who are fond of informing me that my religious beliefs are nothing but fairy tales and myths. Well, in this video, I want to look at 5 actual myths that many atheists believe. The British journalist Malcolm Muggeridge once famously remarked that new news is really only old news happening to new people. And I think that could certainly be said for many of the more popular arguments against religion that you'll find on the internet or in best-selling books.
What he's saying here kind of really rings true right now, especially for pandemic reasons, because the United States went through something similar in like the early 1900s. You know, we had that pandemic of the Spanish flu, and everybody ended up having to wear masks at that time. Currently, right now, we're seeing, or we have seen the same, or at least a very antithetical response to how we handled it initially. And in some ways, it was very similar. Not only did you have people resistant to wearing masks, but you also had the fact that, you know, most people were wearing masks at that time. You also had people still holding parades and infection rates going up after the parades and all of the public events that were still being handled. Like the infection rates would go up then too. So, I mean, we see a lot of similarities with that. It's not all that surprising that people are still as dipshitty now as they were then.
Nothing really new, nothing that hasn't already been said before throughout history. Just a new audience with iPhones to hear them. And that's why I find the atheist Michael Roos rather refreshing. He's a philosopher in science, and therefore he's well-versed in history, well-versed in philosophy and religion, well-versed in all the controversies and debates that have raged throughout the millennia. And therefore he's well aware that all throughout the ages there have been thoughtful people who have raised these objections before. And likewise, there have been equally thoughtful people who have responded to those objections. In other words, there's nothing really new under the sun.
Okay, so before he fades into heaven, I guess, is what he's doing right here. Like, I don't know, I feel like he's got a very weird setup, and it's only going to get weirder throughout this video, so just keep an eye out for where he's at. So basically what he says here is that the myth is that all of the arguments against religion, like, are new or something. Like, somehow we believe that people are just now arguing against religion, and that people in the past haven't also argued those same points, and that at that time people also haven't responded to those points. And I think that this is really a hasty generalization. While these arguments may be new to some people, after doing a bit of research and really learning about the conversation, I feel like anybody with that's done a minimal amount of research would know that this argument over whether or not God exists or whether or not Jesus is the Son of God, all of this has been going back like hundreds of years. This isn't some new thing, and I don't think that most atheists out there believe that any response to any of these arguments are new things. If they really truly believe that they were new things, then I really don't think that they would be searching up for things that have been previously written. I don't know. I feel like this guy is just automatically assuming that atheists find these arguments to be novel and just so new. And he may be confusing one or two things, but this is just simply not a myth. It's not a myth, and it's not something that atheists believe. All right, let's see what his next one is.
And clearly one of the greatest myths is that science has somehow disproven God, that science and atheism are one and the same.
This is not a view of atheists. This would be a view of creationists. Creationists often intermingle science and atheism together. A lot of creationists out there have actually argued that evolution is an atheist argument against God or against religion in general. So I don't see how this can be like an atheist myth or a myth that atheists believe in, because we separate science from the question of whether or not God exists. Hopefully everybody understands that science is used to describe our natural world. It's how we can come to what is the most true nature of reality, how we can describe what the true nature is of reality, at least as closely to what is true as we can possibly get. Given that, anybody should come to the conclusion that science wouldn't ever be able to actually prove God, because God supposedly exists outside of reality, right? He's timeless, spaceless, and he exists outside of reality, but he can affect reality within. Science can definitely prove or disprove whether or not God has a real effect on reality, right? If God can actually reach his hands into this universe and do things, science would be able to prove or disprove that. Specific instances on like the disprove, like we could disprove specific instances. I don't think that science can ever actually disprove God ever being able to actually do that. The ones that are mixing up science and atheism are Christian, like creationist Christians, and those that think that evolution is an atheist argument. It's not.
And yet that's simply a fundamental misunderstanding of what science is even capable of. Science is a study of the natural world around us, of physical things, of physical laws. If God existed, then he wouldn't be a physical entity. It's not as though you could run a bunch of lab tests and conclude, well, we found no traces of the Almighty in here, therefore he can't exist.
Well, that's not what anybody says. Also, do you just run around with a beaker of unknown liquids? Or no, that's not a beaker, it's a test tube. You just run around with a test tube with unknown liquids in it, just in case you want to pop it out for like a demonstration. Oh, you don't believe in God? Well, here's a test tube. Of course God's not in here, so I guess he don't exist, huh? I feel like this is a very simplistic view of things, and I really don't think that any atheist would say that. Now, as far as science being able to describe reality, if God has an effect on that reality, we could definitely disprove specific instances where people say that God did this in reality. As far as like, oh, well, science can't prove God, therefore God doesn't exist. I feel like that's a bit of a jump in logic, and anybody that's out there that uses that, I wouldn't suggest using that particular line of logic, because Christians can easily attack that. There's no good evidence to say that God exists, then you can't concretely determine that he definitely does exist. That's how I would kind of phrase that, which isn't saying that science can't prove God, therefore God doesn't exist. It's a bit more specific. And I feel like the whole science can't prove God exists, so therefore he doesn't exist, is like a weird creationist Christian type of mindset where they would make this up. But yeah, so I wouldn't say that science disproves God, or science can't prove God, therefore God doesn't exist, because there have been multiple things in the past where, you know, our current scientific understanding hasn't been able to prove something, and then later on our information expands, like we understand reality more, and then we can explain it. Just saying, well, science can't prove it, therefore it doesn't exist, I feel like there's a logical hole there, and I just wouldn't suggest using that argument.
And don't take my word for it. The late and great atheist Stephen Jay Gould angered many of the more dogmatic atheists within the ranks by simply pointing out that it's unscientific to say that science can prove that God doesn't exist.
Again, I don't think that this is anything that any atheist is really saying. And if an atheist is saying it, then I would highly suggest against saying it. I prefer framing it as there's no evidence to suggest a God exists, therefore there's no reason to believe a God exists. That doesn't say about the absolute nature of God's existence. That's just whether or not you should believe in it. It's just kind of a good way to go about forming or leaving that belief. So these first two have been hasty generalizations about the atheist community, the demographic of atheists, by saying that, well, you know, atheists believe this. So like a majority of atheists believe this is kind of what he's implying here. And I would bet that most atheists are not saying either of these first two things. So let's see where he's going to go from here.
Now, another myth is closely related to the previous one, that evolution proves that God doesn't exist.
Yeah, you see, this is why I think that he's most likely a creationist. Well, in a previous video, we covered him, and he sort of added in some like conservative political rant right in the middle of his video about atheism, which I don't even understand still to this day. But this is why I think that he's a creationist here, because he's framing evolution as an atheist argument. I've said this multiple times. Evolution doesn't disprove a God, because God could exist and just used evolution to create the diversity of life here on Earth. That's totally a possibility. Unlikely, but it's still a possibility that I can't necessarily rule out, because I can't absolutely rule out God in general. Obviously, I can definitely rule out a Christian version of God, but I don't think that it's a Christian version of God that is just the generic, like, God could have used evolution to populate the Earth or whatever. I wouldn't use evolution to argue against a deity. I would use evolution to argue against a literal interpretation of the Old Testament. That is where evolution kind of comes in as an argument as far as in the realm of religion and Christianity, because evolution definitely proves that Genesis is bullshit. Genesis doesn't have evolution anywhere in it. God creates every single animal in the form that it is in today, right? Of course, he flooded the earth, and he had all those animals fuck and pop out new species, 11 new species every single fucking day. God never uses evolution in the Old Testament. So given that means that the Old Testament version of God definitely can't exist. Also, there's the whole magical wizard incantation thing that created everything. That too is also kind of an indication that it's bullshit.
Richard Dawkins claims that because of Darwinism, it's allowed him to live an intellectually fulfilled life. Yet, why? Again, Stephen Jay Gould, who is famous for being an evolutionary biologist, stated that there's nothing about evolution to say that God couldn't have used it, that a religious person could look at the process of evolution and say, oh, so that's how God did it. Cool.
Well, yeah, that's what I was kind of saying earlier. What a lot of creationists mistake is like Stephen Jay Gould's statement and everything like that, and applying that to the Christian God. Because the Christian God definitely can exist if you take a literal interpretation of the Old Testament, considering, and this is just one point out of a plethora of points, but evolution happened. The Old Testament doesn't ever indicate that evolution happened. So it kind of seems like it's bullshit. The entire Genesis account could not have happened, well, not that it couldn't have happened, but it definitely didn't happen. So that's what proves that the Old Testament's bullshit, are those things. And those are just 2 points. Evolution and the fact that the earth didn't form, or the universe in general didn't form the way that Genesis says that it did. Those 2 things right there are just 2 points out of a plethora of points that prove that the Old Testament's bullshit. Creationists love to take the fact that you can't absolutely rule out God in the evolutionary process and apply that to their specific God definition. And so they kind of play this, it's almost like an equivocation game here with this notion of God. Because while we're talking about this general deity, like a deistic type of God deity, we're talking about that kind of deity versus the Christian deity, and he's intermingling those 2 different ideas as if they're one and the same.
Now, this next popular myth, at least here in the West, is that,
honey, how in the fuck did we get on the farm? We was in the forest, and then I guess the fucking aliens dropped us right in the middle of their anal pro party. No, it doesn't. I don't know why we're sitting here looking at fucking cows. Holy shit. Where the fuck does this guy live that he could just walk down the road in the forest and then come across a group of cows? Hey, buddy, I dare you to touch that barbed wire. There's no way that's like electrified or some shit.
unlike religion with all of our many different competing viewpoints, allegedly atheists are one big happy family united around a common core of democratic principles.
Who the fuck says this? The demographic of atheists, the group of people that you would label as atheists, definitely do not get along. I mean, there are toxic portions of this community. There are people that are atheists that don't consider themselves part of the atheist community. I don't know where in the world you would get this idea. Again, this entire video is a hasty generalization of atheists. Because again, here he hastily generalizes all atheists as all agreeing with each other and all being Democrats, apparently, because that's obviously what his crazy conservative brain tells him. And apparently we're just all Democrats now. I don't understand this. If you could stop with the hasty generalizations, I know a lot of people would really appreciate it. That's probably why you got so much shit for this video too.
Unfortunately, once you step outside of the Western world, though, you're confronted with two very harsh realities. Number one, most atheists in the world actually live in non-democratic countries. And number two, these people have a very different perspective on what it means to be an atheist. Many come from conflicting and differing Marxist traditions, which, given their individual histories, they certainly haven't been beacons of human liberty.
Okay, before he disappears into heaven again, what he's basically saying here is that if you exclude all of the atheists in the Western part of the world, then all you're left with are communists and whatever in the fuck elsists. And all of these people are Marxists. But obviously, if you exclude all of the atheists that are not communists or Marxists, then all you're going to be left with are communist and Marxist atheists. I feel like that's what he's doing. Obviously, atheists were not just this one monolithic group, right? There are plenty of different atheists out there with different political views. I don't have a problem with an atheist being a Marxist or a communist or anything like that. Another atheist could do something horrible, and the fact that we both don't believe in God says nothing about me. I don't model my life on him. But you see, here's where it gets a little weird for Christians like this guy, because for him and his religion, he's modeled his life on Jesus. And I know this because I used to be that way. I used to try to model myself off of Jesus. I was the type of Christian that'll be like, well, what would Jesus do? He wouldn't kick that guy's ass, even though he kind of deserves it right now. So I guess I'll just turn the other cheek. I was that kind of Christian. I modeled myself off of Jesus. So he models himself off of this perfect figure of Jesus. And apparently he just can't comprehend the fact that atheists don't do that. We don't model ourselves off of anybody. I really disagree with using people as role models in the atheist community. I think the recent train wreck that is Richard Dawkins should definitely clue you into the fact that you should not hold me or anybody else as like a role model for anything. I think that you need to be your own person, just like I'm trying to be the best person that I can be, and I don't have like any atheist role models that I'm trying to be like or anything like that. I do try to set a good example for people. I don't think that it's wrong to curse, and so I curse. I don't look down on somebody for cursing. I actually laugh a little bit whenever somebody takes offense to cursing. It's like, oh shit, you don't like adult language. You shouldn't be having a fucking adult conversation then, is kind of how I feel about it. So why don't you make, I don't know if you heard her, but she said, why don't you make content for children? Like, there was somebody recently on Twitter that was like, I would make all of my content for everybody to be accessible to, because you don't know who's going to watch it. All right, let's see. He's got one final fact here that we're going to get to, or not fact, but myth. One final myth.
Now, this last myth requires the greatest leap of faith of all. There are those who are now trying to claim that atheism isn't a belief at all. An illustration that is sometimes used goes like this.
Okay, so before he brings up his janky ass fucking illustration, now we're at a waterfall? Anyways, so no, atheism is not a belief. I don't believe in a God. However you want to phrase that, I know many people out there phrase it in different ways, either non-belief, lack of belief, anything that you want to say like that. I just simply don't believe in a God. That's it. That's not a belief. Inherently, it's not a belief. It's a position. I mean, it is a position on the question of whether or not God exists, or whether I believe a God exists. And I would say no, that I don't believe God exists, but also I don't know if a God exists. That's technically my position right there on the whole God question. And that covers knowledge and belief right there in agnostic atheist. That's what that label means. A lot of people want to argue with me saying that it's not. Atheism's not a belief. Creationists and apologists alike, they love to frame atheism as a belief because that puts it on the same playing field as religion and religious beliefs. But it's not a belief. It's a position on the question of whether or not you believe in God. And that's it.
Collecting stamps is a hobby, and those who collect stamps are called stamp collectors. But is not collecting stamps a hobby? Are those who don't collect stamps called non-stamp collectors?
Well, I mean, there's at least one non-stamp collector out there. Casey's saying that isn't this guy just making our point for us? He is, but that's because he's trying to describe what the atheist response is to saying that atheism is a belief. He's definitely making our point, but then he's going to come in with some dumb shit.
Of course not. Those who don't collect stamps, well, they just don't collect stamps. And so the argument goes that those who believe in God are like stamp collectors. We embrace a body of teaching, of rituals and traditions, whereas atheists, well, supposedly they just don't believe in God.
Yes, thank you. If you were to stop your video here, you would be perfectly fucking fine.
He gets it.
Yeah, I would say, you get it, dude. You finally got there. You're not as dumb as fuck as we thought.
But if that were truly the case, then why do atheists write so many books about atheism? Why do they have YouTube channels and podcasts dedicated to promoting atheism? Why do they go to atheist conventions and organize themselves into atheist organizations? And certainly, last but not least, why, after releasing this video, will I hear from various atheists claiming about how wrong I am and how right they are?
In a world that seems to revolve around what religious tradition you subscribe to, obviously people are going to group themselves together because they don't believe that bullshit. The reason why people would respond to your video? Well, probably because you're spitting a lot of bullshit about an entire demographic of people, and all of that bullshit is not reality. You're just making shit up in your head, and then you're putting that propaganda out there as to create this bias against atheism. It seems to me like the only arguments against the demographic of atheists is to just demonize us. That seems to be it seems to be one of the avenues, at least, for apologists and Christians, Muslims, anybody to try to ward people away from atheism. It's not to make cogent arguments against atheism or against not believing in a God. It's to try to demonize that group of people. That seems to be one of the popular ways to do it. Now, that's not to say, because I know a lot of people out there probably losing their minds, that's not to say that Christians and apologists don't have actual arguments against being an atheist, like why it's ridiculous to be an atheist or anything like that. To suggest that because atheists find this common ground of not believing in a God, and we've been able to form groups, we've been able to, we feel compelled to respond to people spreading bullshit about us. I don't think that really indicates that atheism is a belief. Like, none of that applies to whether or not atheism is a belief. Like, it's a common thread among us, sure. I don't believe in a God. Some conservative atheists, they don't believe in a God either, but we're two totally different on the political scale. I just feel like just because people have something in common, that doesn't mean that thing in common is a belief. That seems to be the argument he's making here, but of course he's fucking wrong. Anyways, he's really fucking with me right now. I'm pissed off. And anyways, that's going to be our video for tonight. I hope that all of you heathens out there that are watching enjoyed this live stream tonight. If you will, please leave a comment below afterwards. Let me know what you think about this dipshit's 5 myths. Do you think that any of them are actual myths that atheists believe in? Or do you think that he just made this shit up in his own mind and thinks that it's true? Let me know in the comments below. And hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe? And I guess we will see you heathens next week. Bye, y'all.